The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome. Today's webinar is part of Cambashi's webinar series on evidence-based marketing planning. I'm Christine Easterfield and joining me is my colleague Simon Helston.
Hello everyone.
Today's webinar is one of a series looking at evidence-based marketing. So let's quickly recap what we understand that to mean. Marketing planning is a bridge. It connects company strategy to action. It's the set of processes that convert statements of strategies for the business as a whole into targets, activities, resources, plans, and priorities for organizational groups within the business. The marketing planning activity we're focusing on today is how to examine trends in business data to support planning. It's the kind of situation when, as a marketer, you are faced with C-level input quoting a trend. How you respond has to combine flexibility in the face of changing data with confidence in your existing evidence-based plan. We'll be using the Cambashi market observatories to illustrate this today, so let's start with a brief overview and then I'll hand over to Simon to take you through the specifics. And remember that if you have a question at any time, you can use the question panel on your screen to send it to us. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end to take questions, but if not, we'll follow up by email. So if you've used the Cambashi observatories or attended one of our earlier webinars, this will be familiar to you. But I just want to make sure everyone today is starting from the same page. We research the global software market from different points of view, using a common set of definitions and classifications, and the resulting observatories provide consistent data for these multiple views of the market. The output is a collection of data sets delivered as standard spreadsheets. The observatories fit into three groups: technical application software, economic data, and focused markets. The technical applications are the software used by engineers, architects, manufacturing process designers, and others to support design, engineering, and creative activities. These four tech apps observatories provide different views of this software market. The employment and value-added observatories provide additional detail in the industry segments we focus on, which are all the segments that invest in technical application software. And for some markets, we drill down further or take a specific view. This includes tools for embedded software development, for computer-aided manufacturing, CAM, and the digital simulation tools used for computer-aided engineering. The data comes from multiple sources, so we triangulate and improve the data using an iterative, refine, constrain, converge process, resulting in a consistent data view by product, by country, by industry, and for combinations of those. Today we're going to look at just four of these observatories: the country, industry, value-added, and the embedded software observatories. The country observatory covers spending on technical application software in over 60 countries, both historic and forecasted, for four key application segments: AEC, manufacturing, geospatial, and visualization. The Industry Observatory provides a view of the spending by end users on technical applications in more than 100 industries for each of over 50 countries. The Value-Added Observatory covers output and provides a measure of the money available to spend by the management in over 100 industries in more than 50 countries. And the Observatory for Embedded Software Tools quantifies the growing use of systems engineering and software development tools. These tools are more and more important for development of just about every product with an on-off switch. Before we start proper though, a word of caution in the form of a disclaimer. This is an imaginary scenario, and the data used here is only to illustrate that scenario. The numbers are a mixture of publicly available data and Cambashi estimates from our observatory data sets. And of course those observatories are changing and evolving all the time. Okay, so now I'll hand over to Simon to take us through the specifics of today's scenario. Simon. There you go.
Thanks very much, Christine. So trends. I guess many of us have experienced situations where we've had a case for business expansion or a change of business focus that's been brought to the table, but they're only really based on some broad statements, maybe that somebody's read something in the news or a press release, or maybe headline figures from some high-level research. Some things I've heard recently are things like, looks like the BRIC countries aren't going to be a good bet for growth, and this Internet of Things is hot and we need to build up our portfolio in this area. And other things like nearshoring in the US is driving supply chain, so we need to focus a bit more on Mexico. We've all heard these kinds of things, and the problem is, how do we make these kinds of assertions relevant to our own business? So for this webinar, we're going to assume that I'm working for a software company that sells a range of technologies into manufacturing sectors. The principles, though, that we're going to discuss could equally apply to construction or utilities or any other sector, really. So the scenario assumes that I've been bombarded with the kinds of statements that we've just been looking at. And there's an important planning meeting coming up on the horizon where sales and development, they're likely to clash over who's going to get priority based on some of these assertions. So the task at hand for me is really to provide some reasoned analysis to help the exec team move forward in the right direction. And we're going to address two scenarios today. One is related to growth in the BRIC, and the other is to do with the relevance of the Internet of Things. And to do this, we're going to look at some generic market data, and we're going to use the Cambashi observatories to put things into context, particularly within the context of technical applications software market, which is really directly relevant to the business in our scenario company. So let us start with the BRIC. Now, of course, the BRIC countries have been a hot topic and a sort of great opportunities for most companies for quite some time. The question is, for us, is it going to continue to be? So to start with, here's some historic growth data for the combined BRIC countries. Now, in fact, this data is from various sources, public sources like the IMF and the World Bank and the ITO and Oxford Economics, and those form actually part of a range of sources that form the inputs into the Cambashi country and industry observatories. Now, we can see from this chart that there's been quite some variation since 2009. I'm sure quite a few of you are familiar with this. And unsurprisingly, there have been some very high levels of growth in the BRIC when compared, for example, to the economies of the US and Europe. Now, as you can see on the chart, IT appears to have outstripped GDP overall, but there's been a bit of an interesting drop towards 2012, 2013. And particularly 2013, is this a trend? Is it going to continue? Well, that was the assertion that we're trying to investigate. And the question is here, are these measures a good gauge for the technical software business that we are in? So let's look at the growth in technical application software for the same period. And this is taken from the Cambashi Country Observatory. And at first glance, it looks like the underlying economic data is a reasonable guide for us. The overall shape of the chart is similar. But more importantly, it does look like technical applications overall has been growing faster than all these other indicators. Now, that's good news for our scenario company business. The thing is it going to continue 2014 and beyond? Is the outlook for the BRIC not really so good, and should we be redirecting efforts somewhere else? So let's take a first look into our crystal ball in the title of this webinar. And we're going to look 5 years ahead from 2014 to 2018. The same set of measures as we saw before. Looks like GDP in the BRIC, is indeed kind of flattening out. But let's face it, it's running at nearly 10% in real terms. So although it's not at the heady levels of the past few years, this is still really good growth. And investment seems to be picking up from a bit of a lull in 13-14, although there's a slight tail off in this towards the end of this period. Now IT, well, it's got an interesting profile, and that might indicate to us that there are maybe some uncertainties ahead for us. But what's important now is to see where tech apps is going relative to these indicators. Now we saw from the historical view that tech apps was in fact slowing down in 2013, and it does indeed seem to be continuing that way in 2014. But from this view, the future looks somewhat brighter, and tech apps returning to a position where it's outstripping these other indicators. So we're back to the question of, should we ease off in the BRIC, or should we maintain our level of activity? And we could stop at this point, and we could draw a conclusion that the BRIC as a whole is still likely to offer us a good long-term prospect in technical software. But we're still at a very high level here, and we really need to know a little bit more about the kinds of industries that are supporting this growth, and more importantly, which countries. And so to do this, we're going to dig down into the industry data for the BRIC and see if we can get some more specific information. And this will be useful to us to set the overall industry trend context before we get down into some more specific areas of technical software. Because it may be that some of the GDP growth that we're seeing here is actually concentrated in some industry areas that are not really part of our core market, and that will be important for us. So I'm going to use the Cambashi Value Add Observatory that Christine described earlier. I've picked out the major manufacturing sectors, so because these are most relevant to the market scenario we're going through. I've also actually left in the AEC segment for comparison, really to see if that segment is having a major effect on the BRIC and driving it downwards or towards a static trend. So yes, there is a general flattening out going forward, but there's nothing here to suggest that there's any particular industry trend or anything for us to worry about. Now, one of the interesting things that we find when we perform this kind of analysis is that we spot something that perhaps we're not expecting, or that it might help guide a longer term strategy. So here, for example, the high-tech sector, which is in yellow, seems to be a little bit more subdued than the other sectors. Now that might be important for us, but actually I'm more interested in the situation here where there seems to be a crossover heading out towards 2017-18 between aerospace and defence and automotive. So automotive in the grey curve, aerospace and defence in the orange. So what's driving this? Well, I'm going to dig down a little bit further to see what the relative performance of those two industries is across countries. And we can see here the breakdown across each of the BRIC countries. And as you can see, there's some pretty different profiles here, but actually there's nothing really in particular that would suggest that there's any reason why aerospace and defence is going up relative to automotive at the end of the period that we're looking at. Indeed, there's still some healthy growths here, in particular in India out towards 2017 and 18. So from the previous chart, what's been happening? Are we being misled by our own data? Well, throughout this session, we're going to mention some notes of caution. And these are cautionary notes that you must have when you're performing any exercise like this. And here's the first note of caution. Growth isn't the only measure. We need to look at the size of the market as a whole, and indeed the relative sizes of the markets in those countries. So here we see the relative size of the individual BRIC countries in the period we're looking at for those industries. And as you can see, China dwarfs the other countries, in particular in automotive. And the effect of that is, of course, that any changes in growth in China will actually mask changes in the other countries. So the key here is that to get the full picture, to get a clear view, we can only really do this if we take multiple views of the market. The second cautionary note here is concerning currency. Now, the data that we've been looking at so far has all been in US dollars. And as most of you probably know, there has been some significant movement, and continues to be, in a number of currencies against the dollar for the past few years. Now, this can easily take the view of what looks like a promising or an unpromising trend into something really quite different. So here I've picked out two countries in particular, Russia and Brazil, whose currencies have varied quite a lot against the dollar recently. And you can see that the historical growths are quite different when we take the currency effect out of the equation. So dotted lines are showing the US dollar currency, and the solid lines are showing the local currency. So if you're trying to look at trends, you need to have this view as well to make sure that you really have got a proper picture. And one of the great things about the country observatory and the industry observatory from Cambashi is that you can get the full data set across all the years that we're looking at for all the countries in dollars and euros and in those operational currencies, so you can make these reasoned assessments. Okay, so let's get back to what we were trying to establish, which is trying to understand this picture a little bit more in terms of technical applications going forward. Now, we drilled down into GDP, the orange curve here, and looked at value add by industry. We don't see any particular issues for our scenario company, but what about the specific market related to technical software applications, which is more relevant? So here we're taking a view from the Cambashi Industry Observatory, and I'm showing the growth for technical applications in the BRIC for the four key manufacturing sectors we looked at earlier. And by the way, we are looking at these back in US dollars again, so those 2014 numbers that look quite interesting come with all the caveats we just talked about. Now, this certainly reflects a general flattening trend again, but compared with the value added analysis, the high-tech sector here, which is in the grey, seems to be holding up better than the other sectors. So I'm quite interested in this. So I think once again we'll need to look into the specifics of this segment to see if this is what may be causing something interesting for our market. So let's take a look at some of the subsectors within high-tech to see if there's anything in there that's causing this trend. So this is information again from the Cambashi Industry Observatory. The Industry Observatory has over 100 industry sectors, so we're able to drill down in quite some detail. And this shows the top 5 growth sectors within the overall high-tech segment. And you can see the upper blue line here is actually the manufacture of communications equipment. Why is that at the top there? Well, that sector happens to include things like smartphones. So it's rather unsurprising that that will be at the top. But also, interestingly enough, the yellow curve is domestic appliances, and that seems to be holding up rather well as well. Now, for the context of our company in our scenario, this could be really good news because our solutions are a good fit for both of those areas. So that looks quite promising for us going forward. So what do we learn from this very quick analysis of the BRIC, and how does that refer to the original statement that we're trying to investigate? Now remember, from these comments just apply to our scenario company, so don't take anything away from here. it looks like 2014 is going to have a slowdown for us, but maybe there's going to be a modest recovery. So we think the technical applications as a whole is still going to outperform the other indicators in the future. We think there's going to be a continuing relevance of the high-tech segment, but there might be some interesting areas, for example, aero auto coming up in India. Those could be interesting for our scenario company. So now we've got some good data on which to base some further discussion rather than just a news headline. And hopefully this can help to guide a conversation on this basis. For the second scenario, we're going to have a look at a different part of the market. Now, the portfolio of the company that we're looking at in the scenario includes some tools that manage complex design projects as well as aftermarket tracking. So support for the Internet of Things might be a hot topic for us in the future. And the people from product development are trying to push this agenda. So how can we deal with that kind of statement? And to help me, I'm going to look into the Cambashi Systems Engineering and Embedded Software Observatory. This is a chart showing the growth of the market for systems engineering and embedded software tools. Now, these are tools used by engineers, specifically software engineers or primarily software engineers, to create low-level software that you'll find in most devices these days. The chart shows a global picture of recent years in terms of software revenues. That's license and maintenance revenues, and it excludes professional services. We have to be clear about that. And the market for software in 2013, which is on the right-hand side of the chart, is about $3 billion. Growth, about 10% in 2013, better than 2012 when the growth was below 5%. But the compounded growth rate since 2009, over 9%. So this really is a healthy market. But I want to drill down now and see if we can find some real trends in this market. So this chart takes a single year, which is 2013, the most recent one we have. It divides the global revenue of all the providers in the market space into 5 categories: requirements, system architecture, implementation, verification and test, and maintenance. And on the horizontal axis, we have the share of market, and the vertical axis is the annual growth, the compounded growth since 2009. And so you can see implementation tools, for those of you who know about this business, unsurprisingly have the largest share of the market. It's over on the right-hand side. But systems architecture tools have shown the fastest growth since 2009. So we looked at 1 year. Is 1 year a trend? Well, I think we want to see these figures in some kind of context. So let's just take the requirements category from these tools and see what we get. Again, we've got the market share along the horizontal and year-on-year growth on the vertical, but we've now expanded that into each of 4 years from 2010 to 2013. And you can see that the annual growth has increased, and that's probably a sign of a trend. It's a consistent change every year in this particular category. The market share hasn't changed much, and you can see it's gone down a bit between 10 and 11, and it goes up again between 12 and 13. And if a category goes faster than the whole segment, then the market share increases, and if it's growing at the same rate as the segment, then the market share stays the same. So it looks like the numbers here are saying that since 2011, this requirements category for embedded software tools has grown just a bit faster than the overall embedded software tools segment. Now, to feel confident that this is a trend, I think we need to see what's happening to those other parts of the segment. Now, here's a different visualization of those numbers. It's a radar chart showing market share for all the 5 categories. And as we saw before, the implementation area has got the largest share of the market. It's about 50%. And this is the state of the market in 2010. Now, if we add in 2011, well, if you spotted the difference there, you're doing very well. It's almost identical. So let's add a few more years in, 2012 and 2013. So they're all the years together. Is there much change? Is there a trend here? It's pretty difficult to see, and one of the things we're trying to do is to get clarity. So I think we need to look at this market in a few other ways and what's happening to these segments. So here's a year-on-year growth view, and it starts to show a clear shift of emphasis between 2010, which is the yellow curve, and 2013 in blue. So in this view, the higher the growth, it's furthest from the centre. So sectors that move towards the centre of this chart are showing lower growth over time. But as we saw earlier, growth isn't always a complete picture. So I want to now look at what the relative change in market share is, just to make sure that we really are seeing a change. And this shows how things have changed in terms of market share relative to a baseline of 2010. Now, we saw earlier that requirements has increased in share, and I think we can confirm it now with this chart. But we can also put it into context of the other sectors. So, for example, maintenance and systems architecture categories, they have also increased market share, possibly even larger. But at the same time, verification and test and also implementation have both lost market share. So it does give you a picture of a trend in the numbers, and remembering that all the categories combined are part of a fast-growing segment, over 9% CAGR. So all five are actually growing, but the three at the top of this chart, maintenance, requirements and systems architecture, are actually growing a bit faster than the average. And these numbers, well, they appear to be telling you that you should perhaps rebalance your resource towards one or more of these categories. Now, this is all very well, but I don't think I'd like to do this just based on market numbers, even though they're very good. And so this is the third of our sort of notes of caution here. The numbers are great, but I think I want an explanation of what's going on here. So I'll need to talk to subject matter experts to find out what are the other things that are driving the market. And maybe talking it through with a colleague, I can see that it's reasonable to think that as a market like this matures, the emphasis on just making the software work through implementation and verification and test maybe becomes less critical because engineers have got this under control. It's the growth in complexity across electronics and hardware and software and so on, and the complexity of partnerships with suppliers that means that there has to be more emphasis on requirements and systems architecture. And so this is where we would expect the growth to be, and we are in fact seeing that. And with maintenance, well, things like the expectation of over-the-air updates and fault fixing and so on, this could also be a market driver that's causing this growth. So these ideas are a starting point that we can now take into planning discussions with sales and development. And for the company in our scenario, yeah, it looks like we should probably invest some time in looking at firming up our aftermarket offering. At the same time, probably not getting too carried away with a broader discussion about Internet Things just for now. So in these two scenarios we've been through rather rapidly this afternoon, we have used multiple sources, multiple views of data to help clarify some very generic trend statements. And hopefully, by doing that, we'll keep things on the right track. Is this the end of the story? Well, of course, it's not. There are, of course, many other factors, only a few on this slide here, but we need to take account of them sometimes in our business. Piracy is clearly a big one for a software company, cloud subscription models, long-term increases in revenue streams against short-term impacts, cases where you might lose market share to competition in the short to medium term because they keep their traditional licensing and delivery methods, for example. Price wars, do you know what the competition will do next in any particular region? A short-term price war might give you some problems, and therefore you need to change tactics temporarily. And regional issues, of course, there have been several quite recently. They arise quickly, without warning. They have major short to medium term impacts. So all our best efforts of planning and reviewing trends can be completely upset by these things. But with all of those factors, I think we are moving more into a crystal ball area rather than into what we would regard as a crystal clear view. And what we've tried to show today is an environment that's provided by the Cambashi Observatories that gives a view based on factors that we actually know about. So that's about it for this webinar. The topic of trends is, of course, a vast one. There are many theoretical and practical approaches that we can adopt. Today we've just looked at a couple of ways in which you can use detailed and consistent data sources to help qualify and quantify some general trend statements, and do that in a way that is in a context and is meaningful for your business. We have to, of course, be mindful of all the pitfalls that might arise when we perform this kind of analysis, and we've tried to draw your attention to some of those. So now I'm going to hand back to Christine to close out the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Well, we're actually running just a little over time, folks. So what I'm going to do out of respect for your schedules is to draw the webinar to a close now. And what we'll do is pick up the questions that have arisen by email. If anyone does have any other thoughts or areas they'd like clarification on, then do just drop us an email separately, and we'll handle those too. So it all remains now is for me to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to join our session today, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.